that it will open up suddenly on my computer, which I don't particularly want it to. So I will just shut that down. Okay, so let me do the live countdown. So while that's running along. So I will do my quick hellos and say good morning, everyone. Well, it's not morning; it's afternoon now, lunchtime. It's really nice to be back. I'm gonna actually I'm gonna just start by praying for our time. We're looking today at Matthew 5, 27 to 37, which is really a kind of an exposition of the idea that Jesus already introduced of the need to be pure in heart. So Father, I just want to give the time we've got. Father, purity of heart is one of those things that we'd all want to say is true of us, but actually it's something that has to be achieved by you, really, in us, just to take away those other agendas that complicate matters and help us to keep it simple. And so, Father, I just really pray that that there'd be things today that little ideas that can be internalized, so we can let go of those multi-layered agendas that we have that kind of get in the way, crowd things out, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So right, where are we? If I move to, there we go. Well, we'll skip past.
Yeah, oh right, so I didn't know you were in a meeting.
I know that. No.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, there's a couple more folks have joined since I shut my eyes to pray. I didn't actually even pray for extras to turn up. So it's really nice to have you here, Henry. Nice to have you, Jason. So we're kind of into the Sermon on the Mount. It's that fourth part. I've called it Lust, Lies, and Broken Promises. That's the kind of title that should get a lot of hits on YouTube as we kind of work through it. But as I was touching on just as we were praying, really what we're beginning to see is in this section, Jesus is beginning to expound that the concept of being pure in heart. And so he's going to address the issues of how we there are sexual issues thrown into the mix. There are honesty and integrity issues, and there is a real sense in which there's a kind of a flow from last week. Even though we're moving on in terms of the beatitude from blessed are the peacemakers to blessed are the pure in heart, there is a kind of a continuous kind of flow. So some of what we looked at last week we'll find has some relevance into the process as we're thinking about it. So if I come back to the text, or we come to the text, where we got to, it just starts like this. So you've heard how it was said. So that phrase, of course, was how Jesus opened up the blessed of the peacemakers section. You've heard how it was said, you shall not commit murder, whereas in this case it's you shall not commit adultery. So Jesus is framing it within the context of the law of Moses. As we've seen right from the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, there's a kind of a paralleling and drawing on that. It's something about this message. But I would say to you that anyone who looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now that's quite a strong sort of statement. Now it's really important to notice what Jesus does and doesn't say in this mix. He also, this is always one of these things. It's kind of, we're so as being English or British, most of us I think here. We did have someone who kind of logged in from Australia once upon a time, didn't we? But being very British, we don't like to talk about sex, But this one makes it even worse. We're talking about sex, and we're also talking about gender differences. So suddenly, for me as a male, it makes it quite awkward because Jesus actually is addressing his dominant culture, which is a male way, and that. You get into trouble nowadays for saying there's any differences between the sexes, but there are. Like I said, I make a joke about this. Some of you will know. Obviously, I'm working through the Sermon on the Mount in much more detail from a psychological point of view in an evening program at the moment. The first time I ever put it together, I went and did some research on the internet, sex on the internet, which is one of those things you don't want to confess to if you're if you're in Christian ministry. Oh yeah, I was researching sex on the internet the other day. But what there are real differences in terms of consumption, in terms of because men tend to be more visually stimulated. But as it turns out, not uniquely so, but they tend to be more so. Just to kind of, although that's not really, we're really looking at Jesus' intention here, but just to kind of complete that little cycle. So, what I was thinking of is just that it's very interesting in terms of consumption of what is supplied visually to kind of to kickstart those desire circuits within us. As a big surprise to the researcher, one of the things they found was there were differences between men, women, and women who are hormonally modified by being on the pill. So you actually have three kind of categories. And actually the consumption of visual images for kind of a pleasurable purposes, what they found is men actually spend most time looking in the face and the eyes, which actually I found kind of encouraging. That actually the naked parts are often kind of trigger in the brain that there's someone is being intimate, but they want to confirm that intimacy by looking into the face, which I thought was really kind of an interesting sort of observation. Interestingly, when women are confronted with pornographic images, their eyes are drawn to the surroundings, the soft furnishings. And you can actually see the kind of the agendas that are at play in this, that deep down there is a desire for connection in men, even though it will kind of gratify and be kind of stimulated by things that they're seeing and looking at and so on. Similarly in women but they're instead of connection, they're looking for security. So they're observing how safe and secure the environment is, and you can understand those sexual priorities in one sense, but actually it is a powerful thing. And the Jesus kind of picks up this idea. You're not supposed to commit adultery, but I would say to you, anyone who's looking at a woman for lusting after her is already committing adultery with her, or committed adultery with her in his heart. And so, very similar way to we saw last week with murder and anger, Jesus pushes it right the way to the internal process rather than the external fruit, the action. The action might be murder, but it starts with anger. The action might be about adultery, but actually it starts with actually how much do we play around on the edge in terms of what we entertain. Is that I can look at a woman, but if I look on her to lust after her, I'm entertaining a process in my head which actually leads me to a very primeval drives, like anger does. If you think back to Genesis, when God creates mankind in his image, he makes him, and he says, be fruitful and multiply, for which you need sex, and have dominion, for which you need some form of aggression. And we're addressing those two things right up front. We've had aggression in the Sermon on the Mount, in that you're not supposed to commit murder, but actually there's something in your heart that actually where the aggression is growing. You're not supposed to commit adultery, but you're quite willing to play around with areas in terms of the way you allow your imagination to go to drives in you that are very fundamental to humanity. You need sex and you need aggression to be fully human. God made you. It's not the fact that it's there or not, it's how it's managed, how you use it, how you shape it. And so Jesus draws attention to that. With the Sermon on the Mount, we have in précis something that's much more deep, but I think it is the nature of how we work out the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, that we share wisdom one to another. So the disciples have to take this agenda forwards. And also the Holy Spirit guides us. The key thing to notice here is that Jesus draws attention to it. There's something about how we entertain our inner lives that actually is where the start of these things grows from. So we find in that similar way, I quoted this last week because remember we looked at how in the Talmuds we have recordings of an earlier context and earlier conversations, which I would suspect are part of the context that Jesus is teaching in, where probably the Sanhedrin, actually this is the kind of the logic where they've got to. So when he last week we saw he posited, you risk judgment generally because you're blowing off anger. If you go around blowing off anger unnecessarily, you're risking judgment. You risk the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin have taught that actually if you call people names and so on, then you go to Gehenna. So actually if you stood before the Sanhedrin and you've actually done it, they're likely to say you're now liable to Gehenna. We saw that thread. So I put this little quote back up: anyone who descends to Gehenna ultimately ascends. So Gehenna is okay, it's survivable as long as you don't do one of these things, except those who descend and don't ascend. And these are the one who engages in intercourse with a married woman. So now we're on adultery. So, but it's not just got the word adultery, it's more specific. He is having intercourse with a married woman. As this is a transgression, it's a serious offense both to God and to a person, i.e. the husband. So this is the way that the rabbis are thinking about it. So actually you're liable to Gehenna, and you don't get out of Gehenna because actually intercourse it said don't commit adultery, and actually not only that, you've offended the person as well. So you've offended two people, so you're stuck, which you can see is really a kind of a way of leveraging their power structure. As this is a serious offense both against both God and the person, and the other people who don't get out of Gehenna are the ones who humiliate in public and who call others a derogatory name, which we saw covered last week. So Jesus is talking in this context, but he takes it a little bit further. So you're not supposed to do that. You know that you're not supposed to commit adultery. The Sanhedrin, in the same way, same framework, who you risk things for, they agree with that, and they're actually saying, you're going to get stuck in Gehenna, you won't get out. And then Jesus goes on, and so he kind of adopts. He says that's fine, but that's the final consequence. But actually, these things start in your heart. Now he doesn't say that they're equivalent. I have actually heard it said that way. I've actually heard this presented, that they're just the same. Jesus doesn't say they're the same. If you have not got any kind of level of self-control in your thought life, but you have at least got the control not to commit adultery, you won't do as much damage. In that sense, socially it is more damaging if you don't. But what Jesus is drawing our attention to is that actually there's something that's only about fear of judgment, fear of the authorities, fear of getting it wrong because the culture is like that. But actually in secret and in private, I'm quite happy to entertain thoughts like this. And he draws attention to that and then kind of takes it a step further. So he says, so now to kind of put it in modern terms, Jesus is effectively saying that this is quite serious, really. If all sorts of evil kind of flows out of those thought lives. But so if your right eye causes you to stumble, pluck it off and throw it away. He's using hyperbole. Almost everybody, right the way through early church history to the modern day, sees Jesus speaking with hyperbole, except strangely in some modern churches where people try and there's a tendency to try and see this as kind of almost as literal as possible in certain extreme places. There is some argument that Origen may have taken it a little bit more literally, but almost everybody recognizes, you find it in the rabbinic way of hyperbole is a way of teaching in rabbinic circles. So it's illogical, because if your right eye causes, you pluck it out and throw that away, but your left eye is just as capable of seeing and just as able to imagine. It's much more hyperbolic. It's saying, do something in your context. If your thought life is out of control, do something in your context to make it less likely to go wrong. If your right hand causes you to stumble, so you started with imagination, and that comes in through the eyes. The eyes are the kind of the source of imagination. Jesus will pick that up later in the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about your eye being good or not. So there's something about trying to cut off the imagination. If your right hand causes you to stumble, i.e. I reach out to do something about this, I reach out to grab, I'm stepping across a line, what started in my heart because I've not found discipline in the way I think sexually in terms of things. I've entertained the imagination. Now I start to act on it. My hands are now getting involved, if I can put it those ways. Then it's better if you lose one part of the body than the whole of you goes to Gehenna. Again, that Gehenna reference is because actually that's the way the judgment is understood. This is what you should be fearful of if you actually get into the place of adultery. And the way I put that, the last line, you'll see some translations will put depart for Gehenna. It really, the Greek word that's used there is much more you're on the journey. So you can kind of see there's a progression. You're thinking about it, now you're acting on it, and now because you're acting on it, you're on the journey to actually doing something that's going to get you in trouble, that the Sanhedrin have already said you go to Gehenna and you don't get out. And so this in one sense is Jesus acknowledging the framework that he's in rather than producing new teaching. So the new little bit he's going to kind of he's going to touch on here, we're going to find it's actually unpacked again in Matthew and also in Mark's gospel when it comes down to the high value Jesus puts on marriage. So we have the context of imagination, which leads to action, which leads then to judgment, which is quite severe in the context Jesus is talking in. And then Jesus draws things into what's a very current debate, which is really quite fascinating. He said, it's also been said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Okay, so that's there in Leviticus. It's there in the law of Moses. In its day, the certificate of divorce was a radical benefit to the woman. We've lost the context of that because in the modern world we say, oh, how terrible, the husband can give his wife a certificate of divorce really easily. But actually the point was all of the other cultures around didn't have to bother with a certificate. A husband could just divorce his wife by telling her and kick her out. And actually this was quite socially, this is quite tragic because now the wife is in an ambiguous state. Is she married or not? So what Moses requires is that this is a public thing that has to be worked out through the synagogue leaders or through the judges that he sets up. There are no synagogues in Moses' day. You have to come to a judge, you have to explain it, you have to get a certificate, and you give it to the wife. and the certificate, and this is important here because one's been dug up. We've actually got an example of what's in the certificate. Actually states that she has been divorced and is free to remarry. The reason I mention that is because the church has got all very focused on you can't remarry after divorce because they've misunderstood the context in which Jesus is speaking. They don't understand that, until about 100 years ago, we didn't fully understand it. And now, although we understand it, unfortunately, the church hasn't changed its mind on some of these things. So the certificate that is actually given is actually an incredible liberation to the woman because she has now got formal proof that she's been divorced. And therefore, she is free to remarry. It actually states it on the divorce certificate. So that was a real benefit. So you know that that's what you're supposed to do. But here's the confusing bit, because this is a really current debate that hits the years that Jesus is ministering in. But I would say to you that everyone divorcing his wife, except on account of sexual immorality, coerces her to commit adultery. The coerce is actually the Greek word you often see makes her commit adultery, but you can use it in various ways. So I quite like that you're pushing her down a line where she's going to have to. Now, why does Jesus say that when the divorce certificate says she's free to remarry? Whoever marries her has been divorced and commits adultery. And the reason he is because a new level of divorce certificate has come in the previous few years, just before Jesus is ministering. And it goes back to a debate between two Jewish rabbis. So there's the school of Hillel, which Paul is part of because he was trained by Gamaliel, who was part of that school. And there's the school of Shammai. And most of the time, it seems that in Hillel is much more kind of open, and it's the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. Shammai is much more legalistic and hardline. So, for instance, they would tell a story about a God-fearer who comes to Shammai and says, "I want to become a proselyte. Can you teach me the law?" and can you teach me the law simply while I stand on the leg? And Shammai hits him with a stick, so he falls over and says, no, basically get lost. And Shammai teaches that actually, even proselytes, they still don't inherit the next life. They don't actually benefit. They can have the privilege of being a proselyte, getting circumcised, keeping Jewish law, but then they don't get any benefits in the afterlife. So he's quite a hard liner, Shammai. Hillel is a bit more, there's a mission to the Gentiles. We need to interpret the spirit of the law. And so in a lot of ways, people say, oh, Jesus looks like a Hillelite. But interestingly, on the matter of divorce, they're the other way around. So on the matter of divorce, the Hillelites take the phrase where it says, if a man finds any indecent matter in his wife, then he can divorce her. And they say, well, indecent could be anything. See, it's so open. The spirit of the law could be absolutely anything. Whereas the Shammaites say, no, when that word was originally used, it meant sexual immorality. It meant she was sleeping around, you see. So the Shammaites are actually saying you can't divorce your wife unless there's actually been an adulterous relationship. Whereas the Hillelites were saying that you can do it for any matter. If you don't like her, she's get a bit old, she's got a bit worn out, you find that indecent, you find it offensive, you can get your certificate of divorce. And so they had actually come up with the Jewish equivalent of what they think of as an any matter divorce. So you remember it in the other passage in Matthew. Can a man divorce his wife for any matter? This is the contentious word, any matter. Is it any matter, or is it actually immorality? So here Jesus is siding with Shammai. You see that he's actually, because he's actually saying, because the thing was, this happened about 30 years before Jesus comes along. The Shammites have all of the power and all the control. Most of the Pharisees in Jesus' day are Shammites. In Jerusalem, they're Shammites, because Shammai puts a strong emphasis on the temple, and the temple, of course, is there in Jerusalem, and so it likes to support that line. So the hardline Pharisees, if you like, are the Shammites, and they're the dominant ones who are often opposing Jesus. We often find Jesus in his debates, when we hear about the Pharisees, he quotes back things that are much more in line with Shammai in terms of criticism. So the Shammites, for instance, had developed the system whereby you could bequeath or tie your money for when you die as going to the temple. But by doing so, that meant you couldn't use your money for other obligations like looking after your parents. You remember Jesus addresses that issue. So the Shammites were very tied up with the temple. So in Jesus's day, the group of Pharisees that were opposing him the most were the Shammites. But on this, he actually sides with them, because he's saying, you know what, the kind of divorces that the Hillelites are having are not proper divorces. If you divorced your wife because she got a bit old and you wanted to trade her in for a younger model, that's not legitimate. And what you're forcing your wife to do is, because you've divorced her illegitimately, therefore you're forcing her to behave in those more immoral ways, you know. So Jesus takes a high view of marriage. You see it that way. He sides with the Shammites, but actually they're often the ones who are in opposition to him. The strange thing that happened, so this is kind of going a little bit out of the text, but giving a bit of history, is as the Gospels are being written, because a lot of people, a lot of scholars will say, the Gospels weren't written until after the fall of the temple, because after the fall of the temple, the Shammites sort of disappear and everyone is a Hillelite, because there's no temple anymore, so it loses its power and authority. So a lot of, but even before the fall of the temple, where Hillel is stronger is in the diaspora. So as the gospel goes out, the early church, when it's competing with as a Jewish kind of movement, the people it's competing with are often Hillelites. And so you found a strange thing where both groups are opposed to Jesus in different ways. The Shammites are in Jesus's lifetime of ministry based in Jerusalem. As the gospel starts to go out, and then after the fall of Jerusalem, the opposition tends to come from the Hillelites. And so in the New Testament itself, it doesn't bother making a distinction between the two. And I just mention that because some scholars say the fact it doesn't means that it must have happened. All of this must have been written after the fall of the temple. That's a step too far, really. You can't really say that, because actually in their different contexts, both of them become opposed to Jesus. But Jesus is, interestingly, therefore, that's why I wanted to get across here, is He's steering a middle line. He's doing the spirit of what the law is about, but the law is still serious. So you're not supposed to commit adultery. There are arguments in the Talmuds whereby people work out that it's not really adultery if she's a slave, or she's actually someone who's kind of now a divorced woman. So she's not actually married to someone because she's been divorced and she's got a divorce certificate. So if I've had sex with her, it's not really adultery. So that's okay. I've avoided Gehenna. This kind of legalistic sort of wordplay is kind of just getting in the way, which is why Jesus kind of focuses it on, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on in your heart. That's what we got to sort with. It's what we've got to deal with. Anyway, I need to keep I'm going on too long, so let me. So again, you've heard it said previously, you shall not swear fake promises, but you'll keep your oaths to the Lord. But I would say to you not to swear at all, either by heaven, because it's God's throne, or by earth, it's his footstool, or Jerusalem, or the city of the great king. Nor should you swear by your head, for you can't make a single hair white or black. And although this seems very different, it's about this. The reason I've said this is an exposition of the idea of the pure in heart is that the kind of sophistry that is being used by the rabbis of Jesus's day for how they conduct themselves sexually, so that they don't put themselves across the line. And I've committed adultery, not just committed adultery, but with a woman who's currently married to somebody else. That's what I get in trouble for. See, that sort of level of legal. It's kind of like, it's kind of like the Bill Clinton kind of statement, I did not have sex with that woman. Well, technically, no, it wasn't what you might call mechanically, but it's kind of, it's sophisticated argument. It's kind of playing with words and missing the spirit, missing the kind of the emotional content, missing the fact that this is what's kind of going on in the heart. Now, similarly, Jesus focuses on another manifestation, which is how we swear. And so people, it's kind of like, well, I'm obligated, as we hear about elsewhere in the gospel, I'm obligated because I swore by the temple. Oh, that's not good enough. I'm obligated because I swore by the gold that's in the temple. That if we're kind of starting to work like that, which is it only counts if I've sworn like this, then actually there's something just wrong with your integrity. We need to drive back. Yes, you may not commit adultery because you're fearful of the judgment and Gehenna. But actually there's something that goes on in your thought life, and it's not that we kind of sit here and go, oh my goodness, I've got to kind of I failed, because almost every man, and probably most women as well, will find their thought life gets driven all over the place in the culture that we live in at the moment. It's more to say, but this is something that I want to kind of make accountable to the Lord and to the Holy Spirit. I want to keep this open to his change and transformation. And similarly with truth, that I don't want to get sophisticated in terms of, well, it's okay here, because the actual, as we do on the in the evening sessions I'm doing at the moment, when you look at the psychology of it, when you have that level of sophistry, you actually find it, you will almost always give into temptation. If you can get rid of that layer of sophistry, it's just a settled matter. If the matter is settled, I'm now married to this person, so I'm not entertaining thoughts anywhere else. If that, once that's settled in you, what you find is temptation is not so extreme. You just don't really struggle with it. If you haven't settled that issue internally, then you're put into a context that creates temptation, and you can actually see it in the brain. It operates in a different level in different people. Some people, when they get married, settle the issue, and there's not a temptation going on in the brain, and others don't. And when there is a temptation, the truth is at some point they're going to fail. That makes sense. So Jesus is actually very modern and correct in his thinking. If we don't address those desires internally first, there'll always be a point where we cross the line and we feel, oh no, I got it wrong. Similarly with honesty, if I have situations where I think it's okay to lie, I will always struggle with, is this okay to lie at this point? And therefore there will always be a point where, for whatever reason, because I'm a bit tired or whatever, I cross the line that I don't want to cross. And actually now it's all come back to bite me. If we can just resolve in ourselves, I always try and tell the truth. To the best of my abilities, I always tell the truth. So I'm not going to be tempted by how to do it. I'm not going to overstate And because when I get like that, then I have to convince you that I'm being truthful. So I cross my heart and spit and swear upon the grave of my mother. It's a line from a Dire Straits song. It's we kind of become extreme because we're trying to project into an immoral world. But both of them, as I say, are issues which you can actually see in using an fMRI scanner and putting people in situations and challenging them, tempting them effectively. That those who've settled those issues, who've dealt with it internally, kind of come through that with parts of the brain just not activating at all. People who don't are buzzing all over the place, and they may at some point they're going to step over and make the mistake that they don't want to make because they've entertained a process in the brain without bringing any constraint to it. So I've taken too long probably today. We're taking a bit longer than we should, but I found it fascinating both in terms of the use of language, the putting some sort of place and control around my thought life, which actually some of that is allowed because now suddenly we're in a situation where, you know what, you can divorce and trade up your wife at any old time. The fact that I'm in a place where divorce is now so trivial, this is Jesus's context, means that even my disciples, because they say that when Jesus says how marriage should be, they say, "Cool, that's a bit tough. Perhaps it's better not to get married." What they're actually saying is, we've grown up in a context where if I don't like my wife, I can trade her in really easily, really quickly. If you take that on board, you've never really settled that this is your life partner, and you're more likely to do something that's hurtful and painful. You see the process. So in a funny sort of way, rather, let your affirmation of yes mean yes and no mean no. Anything more than this implies evil. It's the way it finishes. That there's an awful lot that we kind of have to express. The lady doth protest too much. We have to say so much because there are these internal struggles, and you can see a very kind of clear sense in the Sermon on the Mount that wants to take us just from judging based on the actions to really understand what's going on. We have to kind of look into the heart. We want to see these issues resolved down there. If they're resolved down there, they're not so likely to cause a problem out here. So it seems like an odd place to cut off, but we're going to move on to another little section, another little exposition in the next week. Does anyone want to ask anything or make any comments into this? Go on, Julian.
Yeah, two things. I was desperate to know what Anne's brain was thinking. I've got three sisters and very determined families, Kristen. The two things that came up for me was that it's desperate. The Bible's desperately unfair towards women in today's context, or any context, to be honest. And I really struggle with God and the Bible in the respect that, unfortunately, a lot of ministers have taken Bible and Scripture and used it in such a kind of powerful way, which, whilst it says, yes, if you're holy as thou, the woman will actually just fall at your knees and there'll be this spiritual blessing between you in a relationship. So that's one area, which I know that's probably a longer answer to that. But the second part was that I think that you're talking about marriage and the concept of marriage, but I think the puissance of people going out into the world are just trying to live their life with this sexual urge, sexual stuff that we have got. I think if we're going to get it right with God, you'll end up actually doing nothing. So it's just a real difficult one, isn't it? There's that sort of, what does God think about you and how you're doing your stuff? And how do we actually come off as decent, sensible Christians or shining in the Jesus light? It's not easy, guys, is it? That's why I wanted to throw out.
No, and I think to kind of give you a quick response, that's partly why I was going to drive in the actual psychological evidence is there is and it's actually one of the things that again seems to work with the genders particularly is that that actually men, when they feel like they're in a searching mode, are far more likely and far more open to temptation and crossing lines with multiple partners and so on. There is something that happens though with some people, not everybody, that when they say this is my life partner, it actually changes there's actual kind of a physiological change which you can actually measure. That's what I was driving at.
Okay.
And actually it becomes, so things become less of a temptation. And I would say in my own marriage I went through that experience. that actually you find your mind chasing possibilities a lot less once you have made that positive decision, this is the person.
Right.
And so that seems to be actually part of human physiology. And so secular psychology will actually identify that. Some people are less prone to temptation because they've made that flip. But if you live in a context where you've kind of, am I married or not? Which is, I think, the context Jesus is in when he says this, because actually you've got an easy divorce. I just don't like her anymore. That's a good enough reason. So I can go and get a divorce. It's casual. I can, so suddenly the imposition has gone. So people get married with the idea of, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll sort it out. They never actually achieve that peace, if you like. Similarly, with telling the truth, which is why it's there. If something has clicked in you that says, well, I'm an honest person, what you find is the temptation to lie is not so much there. If you try and be honest because of the context, then there's a struggle. What you find is those people. I've got a nice little video, which in the if you've done the evening things I'm doing, you can watch with a guy who's not a Christian. He's an atheist psychologist. And he explains that. He says, you can actually see it in the scans. You can see the argument going on in the brain. Am I going to tell the truth or not here? You've got a similar thing goes on. So you need to settle something in you. And that is to a degree possible. It's actually quite hard when you've not made the commitment anywhere. So because it's kind of like your brain is more free for all. I'm looking for a life partner. So therefore my brain is more geared for entertaining thoughts. It's only when you kind of choose it and it settles, and not all men do, because some people get married, but they've always kept it open, if that makes sense. That kind of flips down, and actually it's less of an internal struggle. And I think that's really where Jesus is driving. Now, to the degree of things like how does the Bible treat women, there's a kind of a constant flip side. The New Testament has more significant women in it than any other religious text in the world. You run through names of people it commends: Eunice, Phoebe, Damaris, Lydia, the honorable lady that refers to, and actually it's full of women who've got positional authority. And the thing that we often miss, but if you've seen Bethany Hughes, she's a feminist historian. She says the thing that the modern world misses is what good news the Christian gospel was for women in Roman culture, where in Roman culture and in Greek culture, they were nothing more than sex machines. And now they had status. It's just we look at it from the modern world with slightly archaic translations, some of which have not been good translations. This is a long question to say. And we miss, it's a bit like I said, we miss the fact that the divorce certificate was actually very good for the woman when it was given. We now look at it and go, oh, well, that sounds a bit bad. The husband can give his wife a certificate of divorce, but the context it was given into is that a husband could just kick his wife out and tell her, and her status is ambiguous. Nobody will remarry her because she might actually already be married and nobody's really clear. So it was actually a very liberating thing when it was given. But from where we stand, a feminist can look at it and say, how patronizing. But it doesn't really understand the reality of the context that the world is dealing with, the text is dealing with, if I put it that way.
I think your forensic bit with the chemicals in the mind and stuff, Christian, are very helpful, because I think the feeding thought, I think that's the takeaway I've got from today, which has been really helpful. And I just think, I just sometimes struggle, I guess, with how the Bible was, how we're meant to go to the Bible to say, oh, there's the instruction. Oh, I've got it now. Oh, I better do it the Bible way. But I think we've kind of moved on from the darkest times of the Old Testament. But it's just a shame Jesus wasn't living around. Yes, I could say spiritually is, but it would be great to have Jesus to say, hey, we're in the 21st century. This has happened. Women have got a bit stronger since the old days. And this is the context. So explaining the context now with an old narrative is quite an interesting crossover, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I think is, which is an interesting thing just to balance out, which is there's no ancient text in the world. Well, the Bible as an ancient text is unique. There's no other text like it in the entire world, and there never will be, in the sense of how long it goes back and how many different authors and how it's been pulled together and so on. But there's no ancient text that is best known through eyes of limited scholarship, if I can put it that way. So it can sound a bit patronizing, but most ancient texts have been studied by people who study not just the words and not just but actually the whole context. But the Christian church is often led by people who've got a university degree, but maybe in maths or maybe whatever, and then they've come and they've often read, and they haven't been taught how to take the full perspective in, and they've passed that on. And so you end up with a church that has a narrative which is kind of broadly true, but is being shaped not necessarily with the best thinking. And if the thinking is higher level, it's often been critical and is negative. So sadly, we don't have, if you like, an approach to unpacking the Bible that actually explains context. And that's partly what I'm doing here today, is I'm pointing out to you, here's some quotes from the Talmud. And before you got the Talmud, you got the Mishnah, which includes the dialogue between Shammai and Hillel. And actually, we can see reflections in both of those sources that Jesus is speaking into. And that slightly modifies even our understanding of what Jesus is saying, where he puts the priority when we understand the context he's speaking into. So I don't disagree with the fact that actually with the loss of that context, we sometimes have a slightly broad brush picture of the nuances in Jesus's teaching, and that can be used for leverage and so on. I think it will always have been the case. That will always just be the reality. There's never, there is never something that will change with each culture to kind of change its wording to try and explain. You have to have a level of kind of study and scholarship to try and give it that context. So,
thank you.
Brilliant. Anyone else want to comment or ask anything?
Just one thing. The two Jewish schools. Hillel, how do you spell them, Kristen?
So Hillel is Hillel.
Yeah.
And Shammai is Shammai.
So just say that again. Sham.
Shamai.
Right. Okay.
Shammai. Hillel and Shammai. So, and as I say, most of the time you will see Jesus kind of tends towards the Hillel school, which was the smaller school in Jerusalem at the day when Jesus is teaching, but actually becomes the dominant school in the diaspora when the gospel is going out, which is why, as I say, both schools in the end get into conflict, which is probably why the New Testament just doesn't bother to distinguish between them. Because the rabbis, because they were competing as a missionary movement. Hillel's movement was more missionary, which is really useful because the gospel came in and there were already mission-minded Jews who were reaching out, which meant, of course, the Hillelites then didn't like the new church because it was different. Jesus isn't the same as Hillel. He doesn't always agree with Hillel, but he's more in spirit. So you got therefore the Hillelites falling out. So in the end, you can say there's no point distinguishing the two groups of Pharisees, because in different ways they both opposed Jesus and the church, if I can put it that way. But you can see certain nuances where on this side Jesus lines up here and this way he lines up there. So
okay, so they were both groups of Pharisees as opposed to these,
opposed to being Sanhedrin. Okay. So they were two major schools within the Pharisees, and and as I say, the dialogue between them is mainly kind of captured in just about the 2nd century, the Mishnah. So the Mishnah captures their dialogue. It happens about 30 years before Jesus, so it's literally the generation before. Gamaliel was of the school of Hillelites, and he trained Paul. So you can see some of Paul's openness is probably driven. He's probably been trained by a missionary type school, the Hillelite school, as a young man. So, and so there are lots of areas where you see Jesus aligns himself with Hillel, but goes further in terms of, we'll see that a bit more as we go through the weeks. He aligns with Hillel, but goes a little bit further. But strangely on this one, he's sort of more with Shammai, which is actually, it was only supposed to be adultery that you're getting divorced for. When you're just making it a casual thing, it's kind of just a way of making it into a religious way of doing adultery. I've fallen out with her. I want to be with somebody else. So I've gone and got a certificate in any matter divorce. I've made up my reasons. Here it is, got my divorce, kick her out, get somebody new in. Well, in which case it's just like you kind of forcing your partner to go and so I was about to be slightly overly crude there, but you get the you get the impression.
Is there a quality of paper on this certificate, just in case it's needed in the future for me? I mean, is there a particular type of quality of paper, or can you do it by email?
Yeah. So somebody once did one on a lump of clay which we built up, which has been dug up, which is how we know the wording on it. With
Right.
yeah.
Can I ask Anne, Kristen? Sorry, Anne. I know this is a bit bizarre and probably against Kristen's protocols. As a female, obviously, what are your thoughts? Do you have a flavour on this style of when teachers, mainly men in the past and now? What are your not now to a certain extent, but what are your feelings from a female's perspective? Because I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Your microphone's off, Anne. If you
Microphone. Thanks, Kristen.
I think I've been very lucky because although when I first became a Christian, it was in a fairly trad evangelical Anglican church. After I encountered the Holy Spirit, it's very quickly after that I moved to London, and then I was in Ickfus, and then I was in River, where Kristen was leader for half the time anyway. So the environment that I've been in for most of my Christian life has been one that's been very affirming of women.
Yeah.
So I think I've just been quite fortunate from that point of view.
Yeah.
Well, it's really refreshing, Kristen, because I think a lot of ministers wouldn't dare go down a full examination and autopsy of what does this mean and allow people to share that. I mean, that's really helpful because, there's a tendency to say, well, it's in the Bible, let's move on, and nobody gets anywhere. So
yeah,
I wanted to thank you for that.
No. Good. Well, we've gone way over what we normally said we could go over on this one. Thank you very much for sticking around. We've stuck around so much that Jodie, I didn't notice you at the beginning, but you suddenly turned up as well. So
I was on Facebook.
just as we're finishing.
No, I was on Facebook. So
you're watching on Facebook, so you thought you'd come in to join us, yeah. As another female voice in the mix, yeah.
That's why I came in when you asked.
That's why you came in. Maybe you'd like to answer the question as well for Julian, as to how you found it.
I find it normally depends on the male leader of the group, depending on whether they listen to the women or not.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that helps, although Jesus was married, but then I find that with the leaders who are married, it tends to be on their relationship as well with their wives.
If they have a good relationship, yeah.
Yeah, so when you find a leader, and I'm including you as well, Kristen, a leader who gives the wife the opportunity to speak and be a part, they tend to give other women an opportunity as well.
Yeah.
To speak and give it. What do you think, Anne?
Yeah, I definitely, I agree with that.
Yeah, but then when you find male leaders who are like, no, it's me. And the women ministry or the wives goes to a prayer at the end of the day, or just one women's day in the 365 days, then there's no opportunity for women.
Yeah.
It's funny when you give someone an opportunity to speak, isn't it? Though I mean, like if you went to go and find out what a minister's like, and go or vice versa, a female minister, and speak to the partner. But I remember one guy that was involved. He went to a church in Putney, and he was asked "You've got spiritual words for our congregation. Could you just give us a flavour of what's going on?" And he said, the left-hand side of the church. Oh, it's lots of gold, love, peace. The Spirit's really kicking off. And he went to the centre of the church. He said, not so much, but there's a lot of love here and stuff. And then he came to the right side of the church. He said, oh my word, it's so dark. And there's a lot of, that's where all the leaders were. Anyway, so they didn't call him back. That's it. He got
Brilliant. Well, before we get into too much trouble with the stream on YouTube,
is it live? Forgot.
Oh yeah,
we're so excited.
Right. We're streamed live. You've been spilling your beans all over the place.
Forget all that. That's just allegedly. I was all those points up.
Okay. Well, I will. Let's. We'll formally shut the meeting down. It's been really lovely to be with you. It's been a long one today. But that's probably because it's been useful. Hopefully, so.
Very good.
Hopefully it's been good for folks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Cheers now. Bye.